and courtesy should exist between them. That is God's ideal. And I'd like, as we read this, to extend this through to the experience of God's people today, because that's really why we study this about Edom and Jacob, is to see how God would have his children today behaving towards each other. Because one of the things that we lose sight of in our modern world, but it's a reality, and that is, in effect, we are all related, aren't we? Because we all came from Noah's Ark. So we've all one family. It might be a big family, and the blood connection is a little bit distant nowadays, but it's genuine and it's there. And so, in a sense, the battle that goes on here between Jacob and Esau, between Edom and Israel, is a little bit of the picture of how God sees it when his children in our modern world are struggling. So reading on, it says, "And the ancestors of Edom and Israel were brothers, and brotherly kindness and courtesy should exist between them. The Israelites were forbidden, either then or at any future time, to revenge the affront given them in the refusal of passage through their land." And so what God says, no, they're your brothers. They have said you're not to go through, but that's it. Leave it. Take the long way around. Do not try and get retribution. They must not expect to possess any part of the land of Edom. Why? Because God gave it to them when he gave it to Esau. While the Israelites were the chosen and favored people of God, they must heed the restrictions which he placed upon them. So even though he says, I was going to give you all of this land, and it was quite a piece of land, if you look at it, it was from, does anyone know where Israel was supposed to reign from? Starting at the Nile, and they were supposed to control all the land through to the Euphrates. You think of that. Between the Nile and the Euphrates was supposed to be the dominion of Israel. But what Ellen White is telling us here is that even in that area, God says, no, there are certain peoples that have their place. And that was the Edomites. God had promised them a goodly inheritance. So he had promised them a goodly inheritance, but they were not to feel that they alone had any rights in the earth, and to seek to crowd out all others. They were directed in all their intercourse with the Edomites to beware of doing them an injustice. Well, if Israel was to be careful about doing injustices to the Edomites, God is saying to you and I, we need to be careful with how we treat each other. As an encouragement to Israel to trust in God and obey his word, they were reminded, the Lord thy God hath blessed thee. And you can see there King Solomon, who they believe is probably the richest king that ever lived. And Israel was truly blessed. They must not by force or fraud seek to obtain anything pertaining to them, being the Edomites, but in all their intercourse they should exemplify the principles of divine law. So this was God's instructions to Israel, is that they had to show respect and generosity to their brothers. Numbers 21 verse 4 goes on to say, "And they journeyed from Mount Hor by the way to the Red Sea to compass the land of Edom, and the soul of the people was much discouraged because of the way." So, as we say, they had a long way to go. We'll see a little bit more of that passage there. You can see there the Red Sea, and over to your left, I think it's your left on the screen, I'm not exactly sure, but that's Egypt out that way. And then up here you come through to Israel, and then further up is Syria. And then over to your right would be Iraq and Iran. Numbers 20 verse 22 says, "And the children of Israel, even the whole congregation, journeyed from Kadesh and came to Mount Hor." You can see the Mount Hor there on the map. And Mount Hor is where Moses and who was his brother? Moses, Aaron. That's where Aaron died, at Mount Hor. And then in verse 6 of chapter 1 it says, "How are the things of Esau searched out? How are his hidden things sought up?" And so we see here this whole picture of a sense that the Edomites are now being evaluated by their actions by the God of heaven. Because remember, we've just read how God says, well, you are to respect the Edomites, you are not to treat them unfairly. But this was as Israel was just coming up to the promised land, and now he's looking at how the Edomites treat the Israelites. And what you end up with is the character assessment, if you would, of not only the two founding men, Jacob and Esau, but the way the subsequent nations treat each other. And what you end up with is a study, and this is a beautiful principle God builds in here, is a study of the temperament of seeking the Spirit, the spiritual life, or seeking the material world. And that's effectively what Esau did, wasn't it? He sought the temporal world, and of course Jacob was seeking the spiritual. And this just builds itself out as you go through Obadiah and to many other parts of the scriptures. You have this consistent flow of thought as God contrasts those that are seeking the spiritual as opposed to those that are seeking the material world, the carnal world. It actually becomes a Bible study principle, is to see those principles underlying the story, the narrative that's going on. So one of the things that happened with Edom is they were looking on at Israel, their northern neighbour, their brothers up there, and what they saw, this is coming back now to the captivity of Babylon, they saw the conquering Babylonians coming down that Mediterranean coastline, and they beat up on Tyre, and then they beat up on the Israel, and then of course they come down to Judah, and eventually they surround Jerusalem, and they besiege it, and eventually they break in to Jerusalem, and the Edomites start to take advantage of this situation because of their anger and their hatred, what has become hatred of the Israelites. And so now in Obadiah, at the point now where Babylon is going into captivity, God speaks through Obadiah to the Edomites and reprimands them for their behavior to Israel when Israel is going under the punishment, if you would. So we read here in verse 11, it says, "In the day that thou stoodest on the other side, in the day that the strangers carried away captive his forces, and foreigners entered into his gates," that's the Babylonians, "and cast lots upon Jerusalem, even thou was one of them." So what was happening here is the Edomites were actually siding with the Babylonians to inflict punishment and pain on Israel. And that is where we see the attitudes starting to be really clearly put out there. We read on because it says more. It says, "Thou shouldest not have entered into the gates of my people in that day of their calamity." Why were they experiencing calamity? They were experiencing calamity because they had involved themselves in the sins of the peoples around them. They had taken up the gods of the other nations and started to worship them, and God punished them. But now the Edomites were actually joining in with the Babylonians and punishing their brothers, and God is reprimanding them for that behavior. Thou shouldest not have entered into the gates of my people, he says, in the day of their calamity. Yea, thou shouldest not have looked on their affliction in the day of their calamity, nor have laid hands on their substances in the days of their calamity. So they were stealing or robbing or looting from Jerusalem along with the Babylonians as this terrible crisis was happening. And God's holding them to account. That's what Obadiah is doing. He's telling them what they've done to make them realize that God is watching. And that's a lesson for you and I, isn't it? As this terrible event was happening, the punishment, and the Edomites were getting involved, God is saying, I'm watching. Take note. In verse 14 it says, Neither shouldest thou have stood in the crossway to cut off those of his that did escape, to stop the Israelites from fleeing and escaping. Neither shouldest thou have delivered up those of his that did remain in the day of distress. So they were literally handing these Jews over to the Babylonians so that they could be punished. That is a picture of what God was upset with. Now, to bring this into our experience today, it's simply telling us that God is taking note how we treat each other in our wider church environment, but also in our very close family environment, because there can be just as much ill will in family settings as there was between old Israel and Edom. And what God is saying is he's taking note. He can help if that anger and resentment is there, but we have to seek the spiritual. And that's where Jacob, as the leader of his family line, did seek the spiritual. Esau did not. And again, we pick up a rebuke here from the Lord. This goes through not only Obadiah, but he's actually bringing it out now in Malachi, the last book of the Old Testament. And it says here, God making it very clear, he says, I have loved you, this is Israel, or Judah, saith the Lord, yet ye say, wherein hast thou loved us? Was not Esau Jacob's brother? So here God is taking them right back to their roots. And he says, was not Esau Jacob's brother, saith the Lord, yet I loved Jacob, and I hated Esau, and laid his mountains and his heritage waste for the dragons of the wilderness. Now, we have a time frame in here, because God did not lay Edom waste originally. Only as Edom went out and started to persecute Jacob did God get involved and put Esau into straight places. But isn't that interesting? God here says, I loved Jacob and I hated Esau. Now, what we've got to understand is that God is simply reflecting to us what our choices are. Because Esau had made choices and Jacob made choices. And so when God says, I love Jacob, what God is saying, I loved Jacob's choices. I loved what he chose to do with his life. And if you know the story of Jacob, it wasn't all good. It's a little bit like David. You know, God says, David is the man after my own heart. And you look at the life of David and you say, yeah, really? I mean, I can think of some things about David that wasn't exactly like after God's own heart. I'm sure we all can. He made a lot of mistakes. But the thing about David is that he repented, didn't he? He earnestly, sincerely, genuinely got down on his knees before God and said, I'm sorry, I really regret doing that. And so here we have this challenge, this battle, where God is trying to help you and I see that he is aware of these things. He is showing it to us as he tells us how it worked out through Jacob and Esau, through Edom and Israel. So this line goes right through the Old Testament. And it's a little bit, if you would, like Matthew chapter 13 in the New Testament, where Jesus talking tells a parable. Does anyone know what the parable is in Matthew chapter 13? It's the wheat and the tares. The wheat and the tares. And what does God say about the wheat and the tares? Jesus speaking, he says they must grow together. And in effect, this is what was happening with Edom and Israel. They grew together as God was looking at them to see how they would behave. They've got to grow together until the harvest. And so it carries on there and it says, and I hated Esau and laid his mountains and his heritage waste with the dragons of the wilderness. And we know this song. So it's a song with great sadness. It says, by the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down. This is Israel being dragged over from Jerusalem all the way over to Babylon. And there they were made slaves there, conquered, a defeated people. And it says that by the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down. Yea, we wept when we remembered Zion. We hanged our harps upon the willows in the midst thereof. So you can feel the sadness. And it says, and they that carried us away captive required of us a song. You know, they wanted us to sing the songs of Israel. And they that wasted us required of us mirth, saying, sing us one of the songs of Zion. Well, that's verse 3 of this chapter in Psalms 137, verse 3. Come down a few more verses, and now God switches from lamenting the sorrow of Israel to again remembering the ungodly behavior of the Edomites at that moment when they were going into captivity. Verse 7 says, remember, O Lord, the children of Edom in the day of Jerusalem, who said, raise it, raise it. In other words, understanding the raising actually means tear down. It's one of those aberrations of English. You cut it down, then you cut it up. So when you're raising something and it's a building, you're actually tearing it down. So they were saying, no, tear down Jerusalem, tear down Jerusalem. That's what the Edomites were saying. Now, God gave a promise to Abraham. And I believe this promise applies today. It certainly applied at the time when Jerusalem was going into captivity. And this is the promise. It says in Genesis chapter 12, verse 3, he said, I will bless them that bless thee. That is an amazing promise. When we, as the faithful of God in the time in which we live now, fulfilling the experience in Revelation chapter 12 and verse 17. Here are they that keep the commandments of God, have the testimony of Jesus. That is what makes us the spiritual Israel, those that are being obedient to his laws. And so as spiritual Israel, we actually receive this blessing. I don't know if you realize that, but all the blessings that God was promising on Israel, as we faithfully live in this time and age, keeping his commandments and testifying to the love and salvation, the plan of salvation that Jesus has, we become spiritual Israel. And all these promises that God was pouring out upon Israel, we get the blessings of. And this is one of them, where he says, I will bless them that bless thee, and I will curse him that curseth thee. That is quite solemn. And in thee shall all the families of the earth be blessed. And so here we see the Edomites effectively cursing God, And as a result, God is turning around and pouring a curse out upon Edom. And it was a terrible curse. We're going to look at the history of how this developed, the hatred that the Edomites had for the Jews. Now, where this actually becomes visible is very interesting. Like, for instance, we know this story here very well. This is David, actually at this point, not King David. He is the musician in Saul's court, and God has anointed him already. Samuel anointed him. And as he is in the court of the king, Saul is becoming more and more jealous of him, to the point where eventually he picks up a spear and he throws it at David, seeking to kill him right there in the courtroom. And David flees. And he flees to a place, a strange name called Nob, which is a little bit north of Jerusalem. And there was a sanctuary experience that was being set up. It wasn't the full sanctuary at this time, but the priests were officiating there. And David flees to this place where Ahimelech, the priest, gives to David some bread. He's running, he's hungry. And it's interesting, he received, does anyone know what bread he received? The showbread. And that was sacred bread. And the priest had enough spiritual wisdom to realize that this was okay for David to partake. And so he gives him the showbread, and then he gives him the sword of Goliath. And he goes on his way. But someone was peeking in and seeing what was going on. And that somebody was Doeg. And Doeg, we read here, this is 1 Samuel 22, verse 9, and it says, "Then answered Doeg the Edomite." So he is from Edom. And what was happening is that there were a lot of Edomites who were assimilating themselves into Israel. But even though they were assimilating, their hatred of the things of God was very real. And this comes forth at this moment because when David is left and Edom and Doeg is left to carry on his work, along comes Saul looking for David, and and Doeg tells him that David had passed by. Now that was bad, but it wasn't as bad as it could get, because what happened at the very next moment is Saul in his rage called for his soldiers to take the life of the priest. And the soldiers of Saul stepped back in horror. They were not going to do such a sacrilegious work as killing a priest, even at the command of the king. And Doeg picks up the sword and he cuts Ahimelech down. He takes the life of the priest. And that starts to show you what's going on in the heart of the Edomites. Is a sacrilegious, careless pride that says we'll do it our way. So that was a terrible moment in the history of Saul, where he actually has a priest killed in his hatred and his jealousy for David. Now we take another little journey out to the east, and we're going over to Persia. Now remember, of course, that the Babylonians had captured Jerusalem and taken the Jews over to Babylon. They went over there in 587 BC. A few years later, 539 BC, the Persians come down, the Medo-Persians come down, and they conquer Babylon. And so now the Jews are in captivity, no longer under the Babylonians, but under the Persians, who are a lot more gentle on them. And we see that we're now in the court of the Persian king here, and we have a conflict that brews with Mordecai, because what's happened is Esther has gone to the king, Ahasuerus, I think from memory, and you have Haman, who is now effectively the prime minister in this city of Susa, and he's walking down through the streets and everybody is just bowing down to him, and he happens to walk past Mordecai, and Mordecai will not bow, and that enrages Haman. So much so that in his mind, Haman starts to plot the demise, the death of Mordecai. And you say, well, why is that story so interesting? This is Esther chapter 3, verse 10. And the king took his ring from his hand, and he gave it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha. Sorry about that, it's a long word. The Agagite, the Jews' enemy. Now, a little bit of a background on the Agagites. That's the Amalekites. And history tells us, this is a note in a book of Antiquities by Josephus, and he writes here, the Agagite is a term used to label Haman as a descendant of Agag, the enemy of Israel, the king of the Amalekites. And so here we have the Amalekites and the king Agag, and Haman is one of those descendants. And what we see is, just dropping down there, the key point there is that effectively they are descendants of the Edomites. So here Haman over in Persia is effectively an Edomite. They've got another little subgroup of descendants there, the Amalekites, but they are effectively Edomites. They all come from Esau. And that's where the hatred for the Jews sprung from. And so the whole story of Esther is actually couched in this battle going on between Jacob and Esau. Quite interesting. And of course we have the story here in verse 16 where Esther takes that incredible stand because Haman has brought about this death decree for the Jews. She is not allowed to go into the presence of the king, but she says, I'm going anyway. And there it says, go gather together all the Jews that are present in Shushan. The modern name for that, by the way, is Susa. And fast ye for me, and neither eat nor drink 3 days, night or day. I also and my maidens will fast likewise. So I will go in unto the king, which is not according to the law. In other words, I'm breaking the law to go in there, and if I perish, I perish. That is a statement of faith. She believed in her heart that this was a mission from God, a position that she'd been placed in. Here's this little Jew girl who's married now to the highest authority effectively that they know of. It is the highest authority in the world. The only one that would be possibly higher now would be China. So very, very providentially placed to meet this crisis. So that's the experience there of Haman, who is an Edomite, an Agagite. And now we come down to Herod. And so we have Doeg, Haman, and Herod are all Edomites and all causing grief out of their hatred and jealousy for Israel. Herod, this is a quote from Wikipedia that says, Herod was born about 72 BC in Idumea, south of Judea. That's Edom. He was the second son of Antipater the Idumean, a high-ranking official under the Ethnarch, I forget that, and Cyprus, and the princes from Petra in present-day Jordan. Herod's father was a descendant of the Edomites. His ancestors had converted to Judaism, so they take on this Judaistic belief, but they don't have the heart experience. And here is an interesting development. What we have is effectively a carnal Christian. A carnal Jew has got no real love for God, but they're going along with the form of religion, and it's given them the position now of becoming one of the highest authorities in the land. But what does he do with that power and position? He has Jesus crucified. That's pretty serious stuff, isn't it? So you have the first Herod, because there were two Herods. There's Herod the Great, and then the second Herod. And the second Herod was the one that actually had John the Baptist beheaded. The first Herod had all the baby boys killed. Remember that story? That was Herod the Great, not a very great thing to do. And then the second Herod, his son, becomes the Herod that has John the Baptist beheaded, and ultimately has the hearing with Jesus. He brings them in and puts them on trial, and then effectively just sends them back off to Pilate, finishes the job. And there we see Luke 23 verse 11, and Herod with his men of war set him at naught, and mocked him, and arrayed him in a gorgeous robe, and sent him again to Pilate. So this Edomite now is bringing about the demise of our Saviour. And it all comes back to the choices that these two boys made. Isn't that enormous? This is hundreds of years of history of battling because of the choices that these two men made. Spiritual decisions will set the tone for the rest of your life. That's the key here. So let's have a look for a minute at the spiritual decision of Esau. Genesis chapter 25 verse 32. Because remember, effectively, Obadiah is weighing up the final outworkings of the choices that these two men made. And Esau said, "Behold, I am at the point to die." Now this is Esau. He's been hunting, he's come back, and he's hungry. And he looks at Jacob, who was a man of the tents, who was sitting there cooking up some beautiful stew, lentil stew I might add. And he says, "I'm going to die if I don't get something to eat." Now, was that a truth? No, it wasn't. It was an exaggeration, wasn't it? Sure, he was hungry. But I could bet you that if he ended up waiting another 2 or 3 hours, he would have still been alive. So this was an exaggeration because he saw something and his emotions coveted it, and he was willing to do anything to get it. That is actually a state that many people exist in. And what did he do as a result of that? He says, "Behold, I am at the point to die, and what profit shall be my birthright if I go and die?" Now, what was the birthright? The birthright was really something spiritual. It was his place, in a sense, in the line of order that the God of heaven had gifted him as the eldest. And verse 15 says, "Looking diligently." Now this is Paul, who wrote the book of Hebrews. He's weighing in on this act of Esau as he surrenders his birthright for a plate of pottage. That's what he did. He had a birthright, an eternal birthright, if you would, and he gave it away for a bit of soup. Or many people today give it away for a bit of meat, or a little bit of this, or a little bit of that. And this is Paul weighing in on it. Going back one verse before, verse 15, it says, "Looking diligently lest any man fail of the grace of God, lest any root of bitterness springing up trouble you, and thereby many be defiled. Our next verse is the key verse. Lest there be any fornication or profane person as Esau. Chapter 12, verse 16. So Paul is saying that Esau's surrender of that pottage, or his birthright for the pottage, was actually a profane act. Who for one morsel of meat, says Paul, sold his birthright. And how many today are selling their birthright, their love of the Lord, for a few simple little sins that they do not want to give up? And that is the profane act of Esau. And it goes on to say here in verse 17, for ye know how that afterwards, when he would have inherited the blessing, he was rejected. So in other words, he says, I want it back. And God says, you can't have it back. Though he sought it carefully with tears. And when it comes to these tears, of course, it's so obvious and so easily seen, particularly with young ones, that their tears are brought about because they understand that they're about to lose something. It's not because they're sorry for their sin, or they might be going to receive a reward. And they are sad that they got caught, not sorry that they sinned. And this is part of the problem, isn't it? And so God is looking on, identifying our motives when it comes to the tears that we shed. So this was Esau, profane, because he had no spiritual interest. His view on life was simply temporal, worldly. In contrast, we have Jacob, who, by the way, didn't get it all right either. We see here in verse 18 of chapter 27, and he came unto his father and says, my father, and he says, here am I, who art thou, my son? And Jacob said unto his father, I'm Esau, thy firstborn. This is Jacob speaking. So here Jacob is telling an outright lie, and he's after the blessing. He already has the birthright, and now he wants the blessing. And he's stealing it. So in this discussion of character, Jacob is lacking as well. And here is the good news. Remember, God says, I love Jacob and I hate Esau. Jacob was lacking. He did some of the things you and I would do. But like David, Jacob repented with a sincere heart. And that's where God picks this story up, and he says, I love Jacob because of his repentance, his determined desire to walk with me. And that's what Esau never expressed. He never went there. He never was interested in the eternal, in the moral. He was always interested in what he could get. Remember, he was interested in a bit of pottage, and his birthright meant nothing. And Jacob, his father, yes, and he goes on, he says, yes, it's me, I've come for the blessing. Well, that led to a whole experience in Jacob's life where he had to flee from home and ends up at Laban's place, and it was tragic. Does anyone here, by the way, know what the name Jacob means? The deceiver. He was labeled the deceiver. And now he's here wrestling with the angel in the brook Kidron. It wasn't Kidron, it was Jabbok, wasn't it? And here he is wrestling. Esau's coming towards him with a vengeful heart. He's got an army. He's about to kill Jacob. And Jacob knows it, and he pleads with the Lord. And eventually he ends up wrestling this angel, who turns out to be Christ, by the way. And in verse 26, and he said, let me go. This is Jesus speaking, or the angel. For the day breaketh, and he said, I will not let thee go except thou bless me. Jacob's holding on. Ellen White actually says here, in reference to this event, that if Jacob had not previously confessed and forsaken his sins, this presumptuous act he would have been struck dead. But he had confessed that sin, he had forsaken his old life, and he had experienced the renewal that you and I need to experience. And because of this, he had the confidence, not the careless confidence, but the spiritual belief and faith that God would bless him. And so he says, I won't let you go unless you bless me. And he said unto him, what is thy name? And he says, the deceiver, Jacob. And he says, thy name shall be called no more Jacob, but Israel. And here is the picture, the beautiful story of a changed man, isn't it? Because what does Israel mean? Does anyone know what Israel, this is what God's whole people were called, as Israel. What is the meaning? It is he that wrestles with God and gains the victory, or he that has mastery with God. In other words, you can go into a room with God and plead with such prayer and heartfelt feeling that God is moved and gives him his blessing. You and I need that. We are waiting for an event called the latter rain. And God has withheld it because we're not ready. It is not because he wants to withhold it, but he's waiting for a people to reflect his image. And when we become the Israel of today, in a real, genuine spiritual experience, God will answer that prayer and the latter rain will come. Finishing here in Obadiah chapter 1 verse 17, it says, but upon Mount Zion shall be deliverance, and there shall be holiness. That's what it's all about, isn't it? God is seeking our relationship to be so close that we bring forth holiness through our relationship with him. And the house of Jacob shall possess their possessions. In other words, they will own what Esau owned. And this is what it comes down to in this verse of Isaiah chapter 4 verse 3. It says there, and it shall come to pass that he that is left in Zion, so we've seen Zion and Mount Hor down there in Edom, they're the two mountains if you would, and it says that he that is left in Zion, in Israel, in the faithful. See, what we know, and this is what this prophecy is alluding to, is that as we go through to the end, there's going to be terrible times. There's going to be trials. There's going to be world crisis. And God is telling us here that only the faithful are going to come through still holding on to him. Many are going to let it all go, like Esau, for that pottage. They're going to let the eternal blessings go because of the crisis that they are facing. Whereas the Jacobs are going to look at it and say, no, my God is going to bring me through, and they hold on. And that is referred to in prophecy as Jacob's trouble. But it says here in reference to that crisis, it says, and it shall come to pass that he that is left in Zion, that little remnant holding on, that he that remains in Jerusalem, not literal Jerusalem, but the Jerusalem of faith, where the faithful are pleading with God, and they shall be called holy, even everyone that is written among the living in Jerusalem. So there's your two, the Jacob and the Esau. And you and I get to choose because it's a spiritual battle. Galatians chapter 5 verse 16 says, I say then, walk in the Spirit, and ye shall not fulfill the lust of the flesh. This is what most of the world is doing, is they're fulfilling the lust of the flesh because they're not putting that time in with God. For the flesh lusteth against the Spirit. In other words, there is always this war. That was the Jacob and Esau war. It was the Israel and Edom war. And now what we have in our modern day is a war going on for those who love God and are seeking to do his will, opposed by those on every hand who are just after the things of this world. And there becomes a hatred against those that are seeking to do the will of God. That is prophetic. That is a fulfillment of this spirit, or the flesh rather, lusting against the spirit and the spirit against the flesh. And these are contrary one to another, so that they cannot do the things that you would. This battle is real. There is therefore now no condemnation to them which are in Christ Jesus, who walk not after the flesh, but after the Spirit. For the law of the Spirit of life in Christ Jesus hath made me free from the law of sin and death. As we seek to do the will of God, as we seek to connect with God, we are empowered. Romans 8:5 says, for they that are after the flesh do mind the things of the flesh. You know, if people are talking about their daily things all the time, and their Sabbath becomes full of the things that they were doing through the week, then they are becoming secularly, materially minded. For to be carnally minded is death, but to be spiritually minded, it's what? It's beautiful, isn't it? It's life. For as many as are led by the Spirit of God, they are the sons of God. When we are seeking God's will, when we're reading his word, when we are praying and asking, Lord, show me, we are becoming his children. For ye have not received the spirit of bondage again to fear. That's what the world has. But ye have received the spirit of adoption, whereby we cry, Abba, Father. And here is this last thought from Obadiah. The Saviours shall come up on Mount Zion to judge the Mount of Esau. That's our Saviour coming. And the kingdom shall be the Lord's. We're going home to spend eternity with him. Isn't it a precious thought? This world is getting very sick. It's wearing out. The crazy events taking place tell us that very soon we're going home to spend eternity with our Saviour. God bless you each one. '53. Let us finish with hymn number 53.